Fortify Unplugged, we're going to talk about an exciting new feature that allows WebInspect to do incremental scans. This is a time-saving feature made available for customers in 16.2 release. Vibin Arabidakchan from the Fortify product management team will talk to you about how to run incremental scans with WebInspect and the customer benefits from running incremental scans. With that, let's get started, and let me hand the mic over to Vibin.
Thanks, Ronnie. Hi, guys. I'm Vibin. I'm the product manager with WebInspect Enterprise. I'm happy to do a small introduction on Incremental. So let's jump into what's the agenda for today. So firstly, we're going to talk about what is the use case and what are the problems that customers face that we are trying to solve for today. Nextly, we'll jump into what's really the incremental and what we are going to do with the incremental. How is the logic behind it that gets us the results that we see. We'll jump into the mechanics, talk about how we can actually go ahead and do it. I'll do a short demo over there. Finally, jump over to some of the results and discussions and talk about what that process means for our customers. And finally, I'll field any questions that you guys have for me. Firstly, the use case. Use case is basically the challenge with the application vulnerability management, which is increasingly we see customers who have the requirement that they scan more frequently. So if you look at the chart here, like there was earlier a requirement that we scan like an application every quarter, but increasingly we are seeing customers shift towards, hey, I need to scan every week and even every day for an application. So that's a new requirement that has come up in the market. Secondly, the release periods have increased too. So from a while back where we had like a couple of releases per year, now we have like hundreds of releases per year. So this is effectively a double whammy. We have the requirement as security experts to actually go ahead and scan more and also scan more frequently. Now, this is the entire story related to the push towards agile and push towards DevOps process. Now, Fortify has a rich set of tools to help enterprise meet these challenges. Today, we are not going to look at the entire portfolio and all the solutions we offer, but look at purely incremental as a part of dynamic scan that offers one of the solutions for enterprises to meet the challenge as laid out above. What really is incremental scanning? So let me define it as, hey, we do dynamic scans via incremental that looks for new attack surface on a web app. So those are three key things that I marked out, and it's key to understand what this means. So when we say dynamic, we clearly mean as a black box testing. When we talk about new attack surface, I have to define what attack surface is so that we understand what the risk is when we associate incremental scan for doing a vulnerability assessment. And finally, we do only check for web application. So no web services. We are restricted right now to applications in our assessment. So what's an attack surface? So let's take an example here. When we define an attack surface within dynamic, we define it as a URL, the parameters, and the method that goes into in requesting the parameter. The example here, you have a specific page in which you have a method to actually go ahead and post a certain value. So that's one of your attack surface. So as you map out your entire application, you would see a large number of these requests that go on to the application server, and that ultimately forms the entire attack surface of the application. So on the right, have a screen capture of a typical request that goes in. And as you can see, there is a particular URL and the method was post, and you can see a value that was associated with the parameter that was sent. So this is what we mean by attack surface. So clearly for incremental to happen, you need to have a couple of things. Firstly, you need to have an existing scan. We are looking at new attack surface. So new attack surface is with comparison to something that already existed. So you need to have a scan that already completed. And secondly, you need to identify what's new so that you can go ahead and attack it. And to identify what's new within WebInspect, what we do is we look at the requests that are sent on to the web application server, and based on those, identify what's new that's going on to the application server, and that's what we define as a new attack surface. So that should give you understanding of what really is happening when we define attack surface. Let me quickly jump on into examples of how we can go ahead and see this in action. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple of points. We have had incremental since 16.2. That was about a year back. We initially had it only as a command line process. With this current release, the coming September, we'll have it available both within the GUI and as a REST endpoint. The GUI mode, by the way, is available right now. In fact, if any of the customers are interested in having a preview, we're more than happy to share that with them. All right, let's quickly jump into a demo for the incremental scan. I have set up a sample application for which we will go ahead and simulate what happens when application changes in the real world, and then see how incremental will actually go ahead and help you complete the scan and see what is the impact on an organization when you run such a scan. So on the screen, what you see right now is a sample app. It has a couple of attack surfaces. It's basic, it's simple, but it is there to help you show the powers of incremental. It has three main attack surfaces. One is a parameter that is sent when you click on the send button. And you also see two different URLs that point to two different parameters that are again sent to an application server. So in effect, this application has three attack surfaces. And what we're going to do right now is firstly do a very basic baseline scan. There is nothing new in this. This is just the traditional WebInspect scan. And then see what happens when we run a scan through WebInspect. So that will give us a baseline estimate of the attack surface, which we will go ahead and modify later on as the application changes using an incremental scan. So let me quickly jump on to a WebInspect scan. So what you see here is a completed web application scan that I ran on that particular application. There is nothing new in this scan. It is the basic WebInspect scan that was completed. What you see here is you see that there are three attack surfaces, as I mentioned. You see two of them are highlighted under critical and one under high. So these are the three attack surfaces that have been captured by WebInspect. And if you actually go ahead and look at the site tree on the left, and also using some of the step details here on one of these panels, you can actually see the parameters that were part of the attack surface. So whether it is a cross-site scripting that came from the URL that's shown here on the screen, and the value that is a parameter that was used, or whether it is the high vulnerability that is captured in another of the parameters that was sent to the web application server, you can see that this application has some amount of vulnerabilities. And this is normally captured when you run a WebInspect scan. Now let's jump in and go ahead and see what happens when an application changes after a period of time. So to do that, I have a small JavaScript that actually allows me to go ahead and switch the application. So let me go ahead and change the application surface. And let me reload the screen for you. So this is an application that has now changed as you would normally expect after a period of time. It has a couple more new attack surfaces that have been generated, possibly because of code changes that have happened as developers code in and write new code. So in here, you can see there is a new field that is actually sent to the application server. And there is also a new URL link that is created, which is leads to a very different parameter again being sent to the application server. There's one other link which redirects to the same page. So I would expect this application to have two new attack surfaces newly created. Now, before we jump in and do a incremental scan on this, let me just go ahead and show you what are the options of doing an incremental scan. And to do that, let's quickly jump into the command line. And once you give the normal wi.exe, and you can see the couple of options that open up. These are all options that open up when you can run a scan using command line. And one of the options, as I scroll down, would be the option to actually go ahead and use the incremental mode. So it's under option called iz/o, and with the option called incremental. When you again go ahead and use this command line to run incremental, you need to do a couple of things. you need to firstly give a source scan ID, which I'll show you how to get. This is the value of the scan that you just ran. It measures the application in the previous state, and it allows you to just measure the new attack surface, as I mentioned in incremental. This is the settings file that is created once you run this incremental mode. I'll get into again what that means. And then finally, there are some other options. We'll not get into it, but we will run the incremental here. So let me go to the actual incremental scan that I ran. So this is incremental scan that I ran, and as you see on the screen, the first is the option to run wi.exe slash the command that was prompt that was required with the name incremental, and this is actually the big numeric number that you see over here is actually the scan ID, and I'll show you quickly how to get that here. And also next is where the settings file is. Actually, this is the location of the settings file, the default location, and it is the name of the settings file that I want to store it on. So when you run incremental under this command, you actually just create a settings file which has all the commands baked in to run a purely incremental mode. But the command line option to actually run incremental happens when you actually take in the settings file that is generated in this step and then consume it and run a normal WebInspect scan. So again, incremental is a two-step process. First, you create a settings file, and then you run a normal scan using the settings file that was generated earlier. So here again, I have created a settings file and then have run a complete WebInspect scan. So I'm not going to show how the scan again runs because I just completed the entire scan. I can show you the results. But let me just quickly jump into WebInspect to show you where the scan ID can be got from. So if you go to WebInspect, this was the baseline scan that I ran earlier. And if you go to scan log, you can actually see that there is a scan started with the scan ID. This is the ID that you want to copy. You want to take that the numbers that you see here that which defines the scan ID and use that to define your incremental. So once you run your incremental using command line, you would actually get the results as you can see on the screen. As I mentioned to you, there were two new attack surfaces created. Therefore, it is captured here by WebInspect. I'm going to go ahead and again look into you can either see the sitemap on the left, or you can actually go ahead and look at the steps that led to that parameters being sent to the web application server. And if you look at it, you would actually see that it has new parameters that were created that went to the web application server, and this is what resulted in the vulnerability. Let me again jump into the actual scan and show you the time that took. So this was the baseline scan which ran about 11 minutes. This was the first scan that we completed. On the step 3 here, you see actually the incremental scan that was completed. It runs at a fraction of the time. It just identified two new attack surfaces. So it completed about 4 minutes, whereas the baseline scan took about 11 minutes. So clearly, incremental helps you identify only the new attack surface. It only audits those. Therefore, it saves you time as an organization as you're trying to match up to all the requirements that I mentioned to you in the use case earlier. One other thing that can happen with an application is that the application may not have changed. There are no new attack surface generated. If that is the case, then you would see that incremental would lead to nothing new. It should not identify any new vulnerability, and that's actually what happens in one of the incremental modes that I run over here. You actually see the number of vulnerabilities that are identified. If the attack surface has not changed, it's actually 0. So let me go ahead and show you the actual scan that was completed. So again, you see there are no new vulnerabilities identified because attack surface has not changed with respect to the baseline scan. So that's the additional data or insight you can get, and it will help you identify whether application has changed and what that impact has on running a scan. I finally want to mention one other point. So once you run incremental in a frequency which will define later during this conversation, it is important for you as a security expert to go ahead and re-baseline your application at a periodic interval. So as your application changes, you want to understand what the new baseline is and use that new baseline as the step to run incremental from then on. So when you run a re-baseline scan, which basically is a WebInspect deep thorough scan on the web application that has changed, you would just get the normal WebInspect results as you see on this particular screen. So all the vulnerabilities are identified. It maps out all the attack surface, and this sets out a new attack surface baseline from which you can now proceed and again base all your incremental scans upon. During this conversation, we'll again discuss why organizations need to re-baseline and also what frequency they need to re-baseline. But this is something that would help you as an organization in using incremental to the maximum benefit. One of the things that you quickly notice is you get an improvement or an increase in speed by running for incremental compared to a deep thorough scan. However, one of the things that you would lose out is that you would not have information based upon the underlying code change. All that WebInspect or the dynamic scan does is it looks at the attack surface that is created and those attack surface that is sent as a request to the web application server. So if you have underlying code change, there is no way in which we could actually go ahead and identify what those changes are. So we are in effect blind to it. So there's some amount of risk associated with running an incremental scan. You would not know what is the underlying code change and how that impacts your application unless you, of course, do a deep thorough scan. So this comes to the question, how can organizations go ahead and take benefit from the incremental scan modes that we just suggested? To do that, organizations have to have a measure to access both their risk and speed requirements. This is not just from the entire organizational perspective, but also from the point of view of the application that they want to test. So once they have an estimate based on the organization and on the app, they can identify what is the pace required. So with that frequency or pace required, they could go ahead and scan, for example, more frequently, incremental for an application, and on a regular basis, which is again defined by the risk posture, they can go ahead and re-baseline the entire application by scanning it through a deep thorough mode. So that's with respect to how organizations can go ahead and benefit from incremental. Finally, let's take a look at what it means to run incremental as a GUI. So within incremental scan, there is an option to even run this not just purely as a command line option, but also run this as a under the GUI mode. We'll also be releasing later this year an option to run it as a REST. But let's just look at what that means to run as a GUI. So if you're going to take the baseline scan, or for example, your re-baseline, you want to now run it through incremental using GUI, you go to the scan repository, right-click, and then under the rescan option, choose the reuse incremental mode. So when you click this, what happens is you would get through the normal guided scan or the basic scan setup, depending on how you ran your baseline scan. And you can go ahead and configure the scan and run it. So let me just click it here just to show you what happens. If you give it a moment, you would actually see that the guided scan config has just popped up on the screen. So I could go ahead and then click through all this process and then start a scan. Here, this guided scan would have those incremental scan mode hard baked into it. So you would not do a deep thorough scan, but you would end up doing an incremental scan when you walk through this particular process. So that's another way to run the incremental mode using the guided scan. And just to show what I would get, I ran the baseline scan using a GUI as I would with the command line, and you would see that the vulnerabilities captured are very similar. So that's all with respect to running incremental. Let's quickly jump into discussions and results, and also about a process that an organization needs to take in to have maximum benefit of using incremental.
Will all my scans have to reside in the same database for incremental to work?
So it's a good question. In fact, many enterprises do not have people working in one location. They're spread out across geographies. So it's necessary that you have an ability to run incremental by connecting to different databases. So that's exactly what you do. And so if you are making a SQL connection, your incremental, and you point it to the database where your baseline scan resided, that's pretty much all you have to do. So firstly, you configure your WebInspect to point to that particular scan in which you want to run incremental on. As long as the database is accessible, and it is, then it's pretty much independent of geography. You can go ahead and run your incremental scan. So this is exactly a solution you would need when you run incremental as a large organization.
So does that work for WebInspect Enterprise or just WebInspect?
Absolutely, but there is a method to go about doing it. So again, you have to implement it as a process. So WebInspect Enterprise is good to get these schedules and repeated process into place. As I've shown you in command line, you'll have to first create a settings file. So to run this whole process in WebInspect Enterprise, firstly, you need to create a settings file using the command line of WebInspect, save the settings file. And once the settings file is generated, use WebInspect Enterprise to schedule and keep repeating the process as is required by your frequency requirements. So WebInspect Enterprise is a wonderful way to actually set the cadence and the pace. And file settings would actually be established through the command line of WebInspect. So using a combination of both, you would actually be able to achieve the incremental scans using WebInspect Enterprise.
I have a question. This is a great presentation, Vibin, and thanks, Rick and Vibin and Ronnie, for setting this up. Is the incremental scan capability a unique feature for WebInspect compared to the competitors?
I have heard from customers there are other people within the ecosystem who are offering incremental. In fact, there was one customer who came to us after they had tried out many other solutions out there. The solutions that others have offered vary very differently from others. So some of them require that they have a manual overview. So someone actually looks at the content and makes a determination whether the content has changed or not. So that's one of the solutions. So if you think of enterprise with large number of applications, it's not really feasible and it doesn't scale all that well. Similarly, we had information that there was this particular competitor who was looking at a change as a way of as a URLs purely based on URLs in the page content. So every time the page content changed based on text or other information, the application would think it as an incremental too. We fundamentally disagree with it. We look at it purely in terms of attack surface and only things that go to the server, because that's ultimately what matters to the dynamic testing. So our methodology is different, and clearly that's a lot of false positives, if you would, by using a competitor's technology. And that's one of the reasons why this particular customer came to us to go ahead and validate on incremental mode that we had.
I had a question on the technology. Currently, this handles sessions and parameters, but are we addressing the new DOM situation in single-page applications with the incremental? Is that able to see those differences?
Yes, fantastic question. So whether it is a single-page application or a regular application, in the end, we are looking at the requests that go to a server. So the method of how you generate it may be different. You may have lot of client-side activities that ultimately create the requests, but we monitor those changes that have happened, and independent of the path that is taken, as long as single-page applications lead to parameters that have actually changed when they go to a server, we'll be able to monitor and track them. So it would work for single-page applications as it would work for any other normal web app. The only difference or only drawback is still the same as what it is with a normal web application. We do not know what's happening in the underlying code base. We have to make assumptions based upon what we see that enters a web application server.
And this is a really nice time-saving feature for our customers. Are there any guidelines? Like you said, it's a balance between speed and thoroughness. Are there any guidelines we have on when one would use incremental scans versus a thorough scan?
Yes, it's again a great question. So I've been having this conversation with a couple of customers. Clearly, we would want incremental to be shifted more to the left because you would catch these changes early on. And that's where more value is, because your attack surface is not yet large compared to the rest of your application. So it makes sense that smaller attack surface, quicker scans, you'll be able to capture them fast. But that said, ultimately the deployment is of the incremental scan technology is across anywhere in the SDLC process. It could be as left or as right. The benefits are clearly more as you shift a little bit more to the left. And again, to the point I mentioned earlier, it depends a lot on what is the risk posture. So let's jump a little bit. So this particular slide where I talked about the speed versus the risk posture of that organization. We can help customers make that determination. We can have the PMs and engineering team can actually sit with customers, help them walk through the risk profiling that they have, and help them establish a process. But it's a two-way process. We'll have to sit there, work with the customers, and that will eventually help decide what is the cadence that the customer can set for running the incremental process. And again, incremental dynamic is one part of the entire portfolio of products within Fortify. So we have a lot more functionality out there. I'm not getting into it, but it's a portfolio of products we can offer that will ultimately help our customers achieve that kind of speed and scale that they need.